Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to show you a very interesting game in which the main feature was that my opponent had weaknesses and they were more important than mine, and she also had more weaknesses than I did, and I managed to exploit them, even though the position went from better for me to equal and so on. It was a very interesting game. Okay, so d4. And my opponent made a mistake very early on in the London system. So we get this position with c6 and c4. When your opponent plays c6, you really don't have to play c3. There's no need for that. You are going to be the one attacking black's center. And bishop f5. Black is basically playing the London against the London. The difference is that, well, my pawn is on c4. Therefore, I have more space and I'm threatening stuff on d5, and also once knight c3 e6 is played, I get to play queen to b3, and the black queen is forced to the c8 square. And this is a very famous pattern which hopefully you know. If you don't know it, well, you're gonna see it this game. Queen b6 is a bad move, and it gives white a very clear edge, and here is why. After queen to b6, white can simply play c5. And the black queen doesn't have a single square. If it goes to a5 or d8, I can just take on b7. Therefore, the queen has to take. That is why it's much better to play queen to c8 in these positions. But after rook c1, knight b d7, white is obviously better. The queen is on c8 for some reason, while the white queen has been usefully developed to b3. Okay, queen b6, c5, queen takes b3, a takes b3. Now, why is this bad for black? Well, it's bad because this rook is undefended, and white gets to get rid of his doubled pawn and create weaknesses with a sort of minority attack without black being able to do anything about it. So it's impossible to play a6 and to defend the b5 square twice, because I can just take back with the knight, and the rook is undefended. So, knight b d7, if black could manage to play bishop e7 and castle, then the rook is defended, then you can play a6 and everything is fine. Therefore, white has to strike immediately. Now, the downside of the move c5 is that black is going to be playing e5, which is going to leave you with a very weak center with pawns on d4 and c5. But white's advantage is more important on the queen side, b4. Bishop e7 and b5. Now, this pawn really cannot be taken. If you take the pawn, white is threatening two different things, knight c7 and rook a7. Also, knight d6 is annoying, and it's a threat, so white would be completely winning in this position. So after b5, black really should be castling. Okay, and here I made a mistake. Usually you play knight f3 first. And what happened in the game 2 moves later is actually astonishing. I forgot that I did not play knight f3, and I got to play a position that I normally don't play. So I don't know why that happened, but yeah, usually knight f3 is the best move here. And there are a couple of options. People usually play knight h5, which is a mistake because of knight e5. And now if you take the bishop, the position is simply not good for black. The best move is knight e5 and now bishop e5, and after f6, well, you are going to be playing e5, but I still have my attack on the queen side, so this knight is misplaced, and when the bishop retreats or goes to d6, the position is going to be, the engine says +3. I would play bishop to d6 in this position, maybe bishop to c7, but okay. The other option of the knight f3 is cb5, and after bishop to b5, again, rook fd8, white should be slightly better, but this is the best black has. And in the game I played b takes c6, which is not bad, it's just that knight f3 is better. And after b c6, I played the logical follow-up to my plan, with my knight not being on f3, which is weird. I sort of counted on my knight already being there, because it's the setup I play, so I just played bishop a6 straight away. Now, I normally don't play bishop a6 without my knight on f3, but the position is still okay, and I had it somewhere in my preparation, so I knew something about it. Now, if black doesn't do anything straight away, I should mention that in this position, after castles, it's also possible to play pawn to h3, simply to prevent knight h5. So that's also a good option. After bishop a6, if black does nothing, let's say, I don't know, king h8, then I just play bishop to b7 and win straight away, because once the rook moves, I take on a7 and I'm a clean pawn up, the b8 square is defended. So, black has to play e5. Okay. Now, here I made a real mistake. In this position, white is better. I allowed my opponent to equalize with d5. The problem is that my pawn on c5 is going to need tending to, and I'm going to have to play b4. I spent a long time calculating this position and took on e5. It was better to play bishop to g3, and now black should play knight e4, and now bishop to b7. And if rook a to b8, I take on c6 and I'm winning. So after bishop b7, knight g3, hg3, and now, well, I should be better again. If rook a b8 here, then bishop takes c6, rook takes b2, and knight takes d5, and white is winning. So after h takes g3, ed4 should be played, and ed4, rook to e8, rook to e8, and now I cannot take on a7 because bishop takes c5. So if I take here, then bishop c5, and it's check, so I lose my rook. So bishop g3 was probably the best option, and once I reach this position, if we do reach this position, then after rook a8 I just go knight g2, threaten to take on a7, and I should be better. But after e5 I took on e5, and now knight h5, which is correct, and b4, defending my pawn, and black should have a slight advantage even though it's almost equal. But what I was going for is these two weaknesses, where my pawn on b4 isn't as weak. I can defend it with rook a4 in many positions, and here my opponent should have played rook a b8. And after rook a b8 I can go knight a2, and after g5, bishop to g3, knight g3, h3, knight e5, it should be equal. I go something like knight e2, and then play knight d4, and again I'm putting pressure on these two weaknesses, and I only have one. But my opponent played g5, which is not a good move. Bishop to g3, and now knight g3, hg3, knight e5, knight g2, and now the rook is not on b8 yet, so once it gets to b8, which she played now, I can play knight d4. And after knight d4, the bishop doesn't really have a useful square. You don't want your bishop on g6 because it's sort of out of play, all of these squares are taken. So she went to d7, but this is a really passive square, and now simply rook a4. And I have a very good position because I have two weaknesses to target, my opponent only has one. And here we played sort of normal moves. She was shuffling her pieces, I didn't really understand towards what end. Rook f8 is okay, I guess, preparing bishop f8 and maybe some pressure on the e file. I castled. It was better to play king d2, there is no reason to castle here. My king is just good on d2, defending the d3 square. Castles, bishop f8, rook b1. I don't know what the arrow was about. h6. Now h6 is a very dubious move in my opinion. I don't have an easy way to attack the g5 pawn. It was much better to play g5 if she wanted to defend her g5 pawn. h6 just creates a weakness which is going to need tending to. I don't have a dark squared bishop, so I really couldn't have done anything about g5, so h6 is a waste of tempo, you could say. And here I played rook a1. Now that my b4 pawn is defended from behind, maybe I'm going to put pressure here, but I definitely want my rook in play. I don't want my rook on a4. And also, there are some possibilities to play b5, undermining the d5 pawn, and I definitely don't want my rook on a4 in the line of the bishop. Okay, she played bishop e7, just going back. I played bishop e2, rook b7, bishop a6, and rook c7. Now rook c7 is a bad move, but I didn't see why. I mean, it misplaces the rook, that's one thing. It keeps defending the a7 pawn. But the problem is that there's a tactic here which should win the game immediately because of the poor placement of the rook. The rook is basically trapped, has no squares. I continued with knight ce2, which is okay. I mean, it's not a bad move, but I should have played b5, and b5 is game over immediately. There are three options. Basically, bishop takes c5 it's easy to see why this loses. I can take on c6, and after bishop c6, knight c6, rook c6, and bishop to b5. Or if knight c6, I can take here and then play bishop to b5. After b5, if rook b8, that doesn't help. I just go b6, ab6, cb6, and again this rook is trapped. So against b5, you really should take on b5. That is the best move. But now here's the hard part. You play c6. If knight c6, knight b5, and it's over. The rook is trapped. So against c6, bishop c6 is the move. Knight c6. Okay, knight c6. If rook c6, then bishop b5. And against knight c6, knight d5. Again, simply winning, because if rook d7, then bishop b5, and you cannot take the knight because I fork your stuff. So let's say rook c8, knight e7, rook e7, and now pins all over the place, and eventually black is going to lose material. So rook c7 could have been punished with b5 straight away. I didn't see it. I played knight c2, which, I mean, I don't have the same ideas after knight c2, but it's an okay move. Rook b8, knight c1. This was my idea. I wanted to get my knight to d3 to get rid of her good knight on e5, and also to move my bishop away from a6, attacking the a7 pawn. And if she moves her knight, then I'm defending my b4 pawn with the knight. I can double up on the a file and take the a7 pawn. Bishop f8, again, not doing much. Knight d3, she decides to trade, which is correct. Bishop g7, rook a6. I wanted to blockade the pawn on a7 and maybe transfer my knight to c2 or push with b5 again. But she took on d4. And e takes d4, king to g7. I played king f1, getting my king closer, rook cb7, and now again the same tactic with b5. This time I saw it, and this time I went for it. It's not as powerful, and I didn't find the best follow-ups, but I think it's still the best way to complicate the position, try and create the best pawn, of course, and undermine the defense of d5. If these two pawns are traded, the b4 and the c6 pawns, then it's obvious that white is much better, and it's much easier to target the a7 and the d5 pawns. So I played b5. Now there are a few options. Let's look at them one by one. cb5 loses, that's easy, c6, and game over. If she does nothing, if she just waits, because I'm not threatening to take, my rook is hanging. So if she just waits with king f6, then rook a1, and this is indefensible. It's just over. If she moves the bishop, I take on c6. If she moves the rook, I can take on c6. So there's no way to defend the pawn. So you cannot wait. This I also saw. The move I expected was bishop to e8, simply getting out of the way. And again, I'm still not threatening to take on c6. And here I would have played king e2, just getting my king closer. And if cb5 now, taking the pawn, let's say, then rook to b4. And I blockade the pawn, let's say she checks me, king d2, and rook b to b7. And eventually I will be able to round up this guy, and then these two are going to be weak. It's basically about splitting black's pawns on the queen side, making it easier for me to attack them. This was the best option. She played rook c7, which I looked at briefly, but I didn't really expect. And I made a mistake. It was much better just to take on c6 now, getting what I wanted, trading these two pawns, because my rook is no longer pinned. So if I take, then rook takes b1, of course, bishop takes b1, bishop c6. I can play bishop d3, and after, let's say, bishop e8, I again try to get my king closer, and these two are weaknesses. And again, this should be better for me. There is no way to defend this pawn with anything but the rook for now. The engine says white is winning. This wouldn't have been easy to win, but it's definitely much better for me. I also have ideas of rook d6 and let's say bishop c2, bishop b3. But in the game I played b6, which is the move I'd intended to play against rook c7, and I didn't double check this. Now there's a problem. a b6, cb6, rook cb7, this is all okay, and I played rook a7, which is what I intended to play. Now the threat is to take and play bishop to a6, and then push with b7, and then target the pawn on c6, and that's all fine. But she can play bishop to c8, which is a very good move. And after rook b7, bishop b7. Now, I do have a passed pawn, and if I can get my king into c5, I should be winning this position. But it's not that easy. This is way more resilient. Also, after rook a7, if she plays something like king f6, at least she is a tempo up on the game and the king is closer. But she made a mistake. She played bishop e6. And now it's really easy, I'm going to say, and here's what I did. Rook b7, bishop a6, rook b8, b7. Okay, she gets her king closer, I get my king closer. And as soon as she plays king e7, I can take the pawn on h6. Now, if you remember at the start of the game, where she played h6 to defend the g5 pawn, this is now a huge liability, and I just went rook h1. And it should be game over now. I thought it would be. If I were her, I would have resigned in this position. If she plays h5, that's just a small trick I cannot take because I lose my rook, but I just go king d2 and then I take. There's no way to defend the pawn. If she goes rook h8, I can just take it because I queen. So she went king d6, I took king c7, rook h1, I don't need my rook on h6, rook e8, king to d2, bishop f5. And the problem with her position is that she cannot trade rooks, and she would like to trade bishops. If she can trade bishops, then it should be a draw, simply because this pawn is weak, this pawn is weak. She can round up the b7 pawn easily. So I played rook e1, because if the rooks are traded, it's an easy win. It's just, there's no discussion. The king cannot move. She can never win my b7 pawn. The king can never chase me away with king b6. And she should have played bishop e6, just declining the trade. And I would have kept on creeping forward like this, king b4, king b6, maybe rook a1. It's better for me, but it's not winning. As long as I'm out of the c5 square, it's not winning on the spot. It's still good, of course. I'm a pawn up and I have a pawn on b7. But she took on e1, and now the rest of the game is basically a formality. What I have to do is get my king to c5. In this position, without the rooks on the board, of course, she doesn't have king b6, so it's an easy win. This is how the game ended. Chased the bishop away, got my king to c5, she played bishop a4, and I liquidated on the king side. I wanted to keep a pawn on g3 and have only one pawn of hers on the g file, so that I could target it either with my bishop if it's on a light square, or with my king if it's on a dark square. And the tactic, which is going to happen shortly, is when the bishop moves somewhere and I've liquidated enough on the queen side, I'm going to queen and then take the c6 pawn, and then the d5 pawn is going to be indefensible and the king is going to be stuck in the corner. So that's the winning idea. So I played g4, f6, g3, bishop d1 seems to lose a pawn, but it doesn't. It's okay. I mean, it does, but it doesn't matter. f4, bishop g4, takes. And now it's much easier. Now she can never queen, now she can never target anything, and the win is simple. b8 equals queen, king b8, king c6, and that's it. There is no way for her to defend. She played bishop f3, king d6, her king is too far away. I won the d5 pawn, cut the king off, and pushed on. attack the g5 pawn. I could have also played g4 here, but it's the same thing. I took and she took, but it's losing anyway. King d7, king f5, king d6, king f6, and here she resigned. I mean, it was a very interesting game. If you look at this position, white is of course much better according to the engine, but from a human perspective, it's also way easier to play with white. These are weak, and once I trade, as I said, these two pawns, which is the key idea, then I'm left with no weaknesses. And something similar happened. That also h6 didn't help. Not that it mattered. Maybe even without winning the h6 pawn, I'm winning easily, but it was just easier this way. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope you got something from this game. And stay tuned for more chess. See you tomorrow. Bye bye.